He stepped through what he assumed would be a quiet corridor, the kind where polite aliens might hand him tea and nod politely, maybe ask about his home planet, and where nothing in his life would threaten to explode in multiple colors. Instead, the moment his feet touched the floor of the cultural exchange chamber, he realized that comfortable was a word whose definition had clearly been twisted in translation somewhere along the interstellar pipeline. The walls shimmered with prismatic lights that bounced across the polished surface like a disco ball on steroids, and before him hovered a crowd of figures that were equal parts terrifying, alluring, and completely unprepared for human sanity. The first thing that struck him was the sheer number of them. Dozens of alien brides floated and strutted in the room, each species more bewildering than the last. One had 6 arms, each delicately carrying bouquets of iridescent flowers, which they waved at him with such precision he could swear they were conducting a symphony of affection. Another skin changed colors like a liquid rainbow, pulsing in time with some unspoken rhythm he couldn't detect, and a third hovered several inches above the ground, surrounded by tiny hovering lights that blinked with each word she spoke in a sing-song trill that his brain kept trying to translate as a greeting, and failing spectacularly. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, and got out a very small, very human, hello? It was met with a burst of what smelled suspiciously like floral pheromones. He coughed, waving his hands, and immediately noticed that several brides tilted their heads and blinked at him in unison. He thought, briefly, about retreating, but the exit had already vanished into a shimmering wall of light that hadn't been there a second ago. Clearly, escaping wasn't on the schedule. "Oh, this is comfortable," he muttered, but the words felt like lies even as he said them. One of the brides floated closer. She had translucent wings, like glass, that refracted the chamber lights into rainbows. Her eyes, or at least what he assumed were her eyes, glimmered with what he guessed was meant to be seductive intent. She smiled, a curling display of teeth that seemed both inviting and slightly menacing. Without warning, she extended a hand, or more accurately, a set of tentacle-like appendages, from which a tiny orb detached and floated toward him. "Eat," she intoned in a voice that resonated directly in his skull. It wasn't just telepathy. It was a combination of suggestion and command. The orb wobbled unnaturally, pulsing and shimmering in a way that made his stomach churn. He stammered, and the orb obediently zipped back into her hand, but not without bumping him on the forehead, leaving a glowing mark that looked alarmingly like a temporary tattoo of her symbol. Great, he thought, now I'm literally branded. Before he could recover, another bride twirled toward him, her 6 arms juggling plates of what appeared to be living food. One squirmed and let out a high-pitched squeal when he accidentally batted it with his elbow. He recoiled. "I'm a vegetarian?" he said lamely. She blinked, clearly not understanding the word, and her hands, or appendages, twitched in some kind of delicate, choreographed display of disappointment. He ducked just in time as one of the floating cakes spat a glob of neon cream at his shoulder. A different bride began a sort of dance in the corner, spinning and hopping in zero-gravity arcs, leaving trails of sparkles in the air that smelled faintly of honey and ozone. Her arms flailed in an elegant but utterly chaotic pattern, and with each spin she sent small ribbons of light toward him, which he realized too late were tethered to him with a sticky, luminous substance. The ribbons wrapped around his waist and arms, binding him in a glittering embrace. He struggled, tripping over a small hovering orb that might have been another bride's pet, and ended up face first on the glowing floor. He looked up at a pair of eyes that regarded him with what could only be described as amused judgment, and thought, this is what they meant by comfortable. Right. Somewhere behind the case, a robotic attendant floated past, holding a clipboard. "Welcome, participant. Please engage with all brides according to interstellar protocol. Enjoy your stay," it said in a tone that suggested both cheer and menace. The man blinked, slowly standing up, brushing off his shirt. Protocol? What protocol? He hadn't even signed up for a single dance, a single meal, or a single gaze into what appeared to be telepathic minds that were scanning him like a human artifact in a museum exhibit. One of the brides approached, hovering inches from his face. She had luminous hair that flowed around her like liquid metal, and she pressed her hand, or whatever passed for a hand, against his chest. Suddenly he felt a rush of warmth, a mental whispering that seemed to suggest affection? Desire? He wasn't entirely sure, and neither was his brain. All he knew was that the blush creeping up his neck was not his fault. It was interstellar physics. The door shimmered again, a new wall forming in the space where he had hoped an exit might be. He turned to look for any signs of escape and found none. He was trapped, surrounded by dozens of alien brides, all radiating intent, expectation, and something vaguely dangerous in the form of pheromone bursts that occasionally left him dizzy. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, which felt suddenly inadequate for the magnitude of his predicament. "Okay," he muttered to no one in particular. "Maybe just play along, just enough to survive." And as he looked around the chamber, trying to memorize faces and species and who might be the most likely to literally eat him if offended, he realized that survival in this room wasn't just about physical agility. It was about social maneuvering, charm, and most importantly, a keen sense of comedy. Because if he couldn't laugh, he would surely scream. And then, without warning, one of the brides lunged forward with a theatrical flourish, swinging a glowing platter toward him. He ducked. The platter missed by a fraction of an inch, smashing against the wall and sending shards of edible, squirming jelly flying into the air. One of the brides squealed in delight at the chaos he had caused, while another gave him a mental glare that conveyed everything from mild annoyance to, "You may be mine if you survive this evening." It occurred to him then, with horrifying clarity, that this was not a room designed for comfort. It was a room designed to overwhelm, seduce, and utterly destroy any notion of human composure. And somehow, he had been chosen as the prize. As he scrambled to his feet, brushing sticky remnants off his suit, he muttered under his breath, "Well, at least they're polite about it, ish." But no one heard him. Everyone was far too busy making him wonder how he had survived 5 minutes in this room without fainting, screaming, or accidentally agreeing to at least 3 interstellar marriages. And somewhere in the back of his mind, beneath the panic and the sticky alien jellies, a tiny, reluctant part of him wondered, maybe this wouldn't be entirely terrible. Because if he survived, the story would be hilarious. And survival, he realized, was going to take every ounce of charm, wit, and human foolishness he could muster. He barely had time to catch his breath before the next round of chaos began. The brides, apparently sensing his momentary pause as a weakness, advanced with a coordinated enthusiasm that would have been impressive if it weren't so terrifying. One of the 6-armed brides produced a set of gleaming musical instruments, each shaped like a bizarre hybrid of a harp and a squid, and began playing an otherworldly tune that sent tiny sparks of light dancing across the floor. The melody was hypnotic, and he felt his limbs beginning to move involuntarily, swaying in rhythm to the alien music. He fought it, muttering excuses to himself. "I can't dance. I have 2 left feet. Wait, actually, I have 2 feet, period." Before he could step backward, another bride hovered in front of him, her translucent wings flaring as she launched a series of tiny floating orbs. Each orb contained a different miniature challenge. One demanded he recite poetry in a series of clicks and hums, another required him to eat a living, quivering dessert that looked like a tiny gelatinous starfish, and the last one was, well, it just squealed, which apparently counted as a test. He tried to keep up, mimicking the clicks and hums as best he could, which only made the orbs react violently, bouncing around his head and sticking to his hair. When he finally grabbed one to eat it, it wriggled violently, leaving a faint tickling sensation on his tongue. He gagged, swallowed, and hoped that somehow he hadn't insulted an entire species in the process. All the while, another bride with liquid metal hair twirled toward him in slow, zero-gravity spins. Each rotation left behind a trail of shimmering light ribbons that slithered across his shoulders, wrapping around his arms, and attempting to pull him into a bizarre, weightless waltz. He flailed, nearly toppling into the floating dessert orb, but somehow managed to stay upright, only to be caught in the sticky threads of a third bride who seemed convinced that the best way to prove his worthiness was by enveloping him in an iridescent cocoon. He struggled, twisting and ducking, but every move only entangled him further, and he started to think that maybe, just maybe, human flexibility had limits. A telepathic bride suddenly entered his mind with a flurry of whispered thoughts, flooding him with images of dancing, kissing, and romantic devotion. His head spun as he tried to focus on her words, but it was like listening to 10 radio stations playing simultaneously in a language he didn't understand. He flinched and accidentally brushed her arm, which sent her mental signal skyrocketing into some sort of ecstatic frenzy. He immediately flinched again, his face heating up as he realized she now thought he was interested. And before he could clarify, another bride caught the mental echo and joined in, creating a feedback loop of flirtation, mental projections, and phenomenal confusion that left him staggering across the room like a drunk human in a hall of psychedelic mirrors. It wasn't just mental and physical chaos. Food and drink had entered the fray. One bride hovered over him with a platter of squirming, sentient jelly cubes that looked almost cute, until one jumped and clung to his shoulder like a sticky, giggling pet. Another splashed him with glowing liquid that he assumed was meant to symbolize affection, though it smelled faintly of sulfur and almonds. He flailed, trying to dodge, but only succeeded in spreading the mess across the floor, where it interacted with a small hovering orb to create a small neon explosion that left him covered in rainbow goo. One of the brides squealed in delight, clearly impressed with his enthusiasm, while he gasped, thinking, "I did not sign up for any of this." Despite the chaos, he started noticing patterns. Each bride had a weakness in her ritual. The juggling bride always slowed down if he mimicked her movements, the liquid metal-haired bride seemed to respond to laughter, and the telepathic bride appeared flustered if he deliberately thought of completely mundane things, like laundry or tax returns. He began to experiment cautiously, attempting small maneuvers to survive the flurry. It was a delicate balancing act. One wrong move could either offend a bride, trigger another round of zero-gravity spins, or result in a mental overload that left him blinking dumbly at the floor. At one point, he was flanked by 3 brides simultaneously. One pressed her glowing hands to his shoulders, sending a wave of warmth and undeniable mental suggestion. Another dangled a shimmering dessert just out of reach, and the third twirled in a dance that seemed to defy gravity, creating ribbons that tangled around his legs and arms. He tried to negotiate silently, waving his hands and muttering incomprehensible apologies, but his gestures only seemed to signal that he was engaged in the games wholeheartedly. The brides squealed, laughed, and twirled even faster, leaving him looking like a human pinball bouncing through an arena of radiant, amorous chaos. Amid all this, subtle romantic sparks began to flicker. A bride with soft, pastel-colored wings paused mid-spin to glance at him with an expression that seemed almost genuine. She wasn't just testing him, or assaulting him with rituals, she was curious. He realized he could use charm, humor, and accidental kindness to navigate this madness. When he stumbled and accidentally caught her before she fell into one of the light ribbons, she gave him a look that made his chest tighten, and suddenly he was invested, not just in surviving, but in connecting. He smiled awkwardly, muttering, "Guess I'm your human bodyguard?" She blinked, telepathic blush spreading across her mental signal, and the other brides noticed, giving him glares that mixed jealousy and approval in a way that made him sweat. He tried to keep up, improvising as best he could, juggling telepathic messages, sticky desserts, and spinning ribbons with a kind of desperate human ingenuity. Somehow, by fluke and by charm, he survived the first hour of chaos without being branded permanently or teleported into an entirely different dimension. Yet even as he caught his breath, he knew that the worst was yet to come. The brides were warming up, combining rituals, creating patterns of chaos that no human could possibly anticipate. He glanced around the room, sticky, dizzy, and mentally exhausted, and muttered, "This is definitely not what anyone meant by comfortable." A sudden flurry of confetti erupted from a hidden cannon above his head, covering him in sparkling powder that stuck to the goo, ribbons, and floating orbs. He looked up to see all the brides cheering, telepathically and physically, at his supposed performance. He had no idea what he was supposed to be performing, but apparently, he was doing well. Well enough that he was now officially a participant in the next phase of the evening, a combined bridal trial that would test every ounce of human dexterity, wit, and charm he had, while keeping him hopelessly entangled in amorous, pheromone-laden chaos. And he knew that if he survived that, the evening would be over. Maybe. He hoped. The moment he thought he had caught his breath, the room erupted again, this time in a spectacle that could only be described as utter, interstellar bedlam. The brides seemed to have coordinated a full-scale assault of affection and absurdity. One hovered directly above him, spinning ribbons that wrapped around his arms and legs like a glittering, unyielding cage. Another twirled on the opposite side, throwing bouquets of tiny, glowing flowers that emitted faint, intoxicating pheromones. He sneezed, then ducked, then fell backward into a cluster of floating dessert cubes that squirmed and squeaked in protest. He rolled onto the floor, blinking through a haze of multicolored lights and sticky goo, wondering if any human had ever survived such a scene without going completely insane. Somewhere in the chaos, a bride with translucent, glass-like wings pressed close, brushing her floating hair against his cheek. Her telepathy washed over him with an intensity that made his knees weak and his thoughts scatter. He realized that she wasn't just performing rituals for his approval, she genuinely wanted his attention. He panicked, trying to think of something clever or witty to respond mentally, but all he managed was a flustered, hello, nice, which she took as flirtation, clearly delighted. Immediately, other brides picked up on the signal, interpreting it in their own way. One hovered closer, a mischievous grin spreading across her iridescent face, while another unleashed a small plume of pheromone that left him gasping for air. He stumbled backward into a low-gravity zone, where everything floated, including dessert cubes, ribbons, and his own dignity. One particularly aggressive bride decided this was the perfect moment to initiate a wrestling-style mating dance. He tried to dodge, but she wrapped him in a swirling, glittering embrace, pulling him into an awkward, zero-gravity spin that left him flailing like a puppet with tangled strings. The ribbons from other brides caught on his limbs, and suddenly he was suspended in midair, arms and legs entwined in a chaotic tapestry of light, color, and amorous intent. He could feel hearts, or whatever the alien equivalent was, beating around him as he tried to untangle himself without offending anyone, a task that proved increasingly impossible. Amid all the chaos, he caught sight of the bride he had instinctively connected with earlier. She hovered close, her expression calm compared to the pandemonium surrounding them. He took a deep breath and decided to attempt a small act of courage. Carefully, he extended a hand, steadying her when a rogue dessert cube floated past. She blinked, surprised, then telepathically expressed something that made his chest ache with the strangest combination of panic and hope, trust. It was the first clear connection he had made in the storm of brides, and it gave him the tiniest, most precarious sense of control. Unfortunately, his moment of triumph was short-lived. The telepathic bride who had taken offense at his flustered greeting earlier sensed this connection, and reacted by intensifying her mental assault. His head spun with overlapping thoughts, desires, and mental images that were supposed to represent love, loyalty, and commitment. He clutched at his temples, trying to sort out which thoughts were his and which were hers, only to realize that another bride had pressed a glowing hand against his chest, sending a wave of warmth that made his heart pound involuntarily. He gasped, stumbled, and accidentally brushed against the third bride, who squealed and sent a tethered ribbon around his waist, further complicating his already hopelessly tangled situation. Then came the binding ceremony. He had glimpsed it earlier in a holographic display, thinking it was just part of the decor, but now he realized that one bride was preparing to execute a ritual that would seal him as her official mate, permanently. She floated forward, her arms outstretched, and began chanting in a language that made the air shimmer. He backed away, slipping over sticky neon goo, nearly toppling into a floating dessert orb that looked like it had teeth. His brain raced. If he didn't act, he would be committed in a way that no human law could ever undo. Yet any sudden move risked offending every other bride in the room. Desperation fueled ingenuity. He reached out, grabbing the nearest ribbons, and began weaving them in a chaotic pattern, trying to redirect the bride's energy. It was a delicate balancing act. A misstep could trigger a mental backlash, Another pheromone cloud, or worse, a literal attack from one of the floating, semi-sentient desserts. He twisted, ducked, and spun, all while maintaining some semblance of charm, accidentally creating a dazzling, impromptu display of human ingenuity that seemed to impress a few brides while infuriating others. One bride, the one he had bonded with earlier, seized the moment. She floated closer and whispered telepathically, asking him to focus solely on her. It was reckless, foolish, and terrifying, but it also created a narrow path through the chaos. He followed her guidance, dodging ribbons, pastries, and pheromone clouds, gradually untangling himself from the worst of the mess. It was a perilous dance, a combination of luck, timing, and sheer human nerve. By the time the binding ceremony's chanting reached a crescendo, he was face to face with the bride he actually liked. Her gaze met his, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of calm amidst the storm. He nodded, she responded with a telepathic blush, and suddenly the ritual seemed optional. The other brides paused mid-air, confused, some whispering telepathically to each other. He took advantage of the momentary pause, slipping free of a particularly aggressive ribbon and floating dessert combination, landing clumsily but upright on a glowing platform. Even as he caught his breath, the room hummed with residual energy, ribbons waving like sentient snakes, bouquets quivering with anticipation, and dessert cubes squeaking in indignation. He looked around at the brides, all of whom had varying expressions: curiosity, amusement, jealousy, admiration. Somehow, in the middle of this intergalactic storm of romantic, chaotic, and adult absurdity, he had survived and even managed to forge a tenuous connection. He sighed, brushing sticky remnants from his suit and muttering, "I think maybe this isn't so bad?" Immediately, a telepathic chorus erupted, and he realized he had spoken aloud. The brides blinked, some in approval, others in mock horror, but the chaos had calmed enough to give him a moment to breathe. He was still covered in goo, ribbons, and a faint neon glow, but he had survived the worst of the night, and he had learned a valuable lesson. In a room full of alien brides, human ingenuity, charm, and sheer panicked improvisation could be more powerful than the most elaborate interstellar mating ritual. And yet, just as he allowed himself a tiny smile, a sudden flicker of light at the edge of the chamber reminded him that the evening was far from over. Somewhere, deeper within the room, a new phase of challenges awaited. But for now, he had survived, and he had someone to survive it with, even if that someone was still partly translucent, floating, and radiating pheromones that made his head spin. By the time he caught his breath, the room had escalated to a level of chaos that seemed physically impossible. Ribbons of light, floating desserts, and bouquets of iridescent flowers swirled around him, each bride performing her rituals with a mixture of determination, delight, and occasional mischief. The telepathic chatter was nearly deafening in his mind, overlapping with sporadic bursts of pheromones that made him dizzy and vaguely euphoric. Somewhere above, a confetti cannon readied itself, and he could feel that the brides were coordinating their next round of coordinated chaos. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, he might end up trapped in some permanent state of zero-gravity entanglement, forever floating in a kaleidoscope of amorous energy. He glanced at the bride who had become his ally, the one who had guided him through the previous storms of ribbons and mental projections. Her translucent wings glimmered in the prismatic light, and her gaze, though gentle, held a spark of mischievous determination. He realized that he didn't just want to survive, he wanted to survive with her. That tiny thread of desire gave him focus amidst the madness. Slowly, deliberately, he began to move, weaving between floating brides and quivering desserts, using humor, charm, and a bit of sheer luck to navigate the tangled web of chaos. The first step was distraction. He reached out, grabbing a floating orb and tossing it toward a bride who had been advancing with what looked like a zero-gravity embrace of doom. The orb bounced harmlessly off her glowing skin, and for a moment, her attention shifted to the flying object, giving him a narrow window to slip past. Another bride, distracted by the spectacle, attempted to launch a ribbon attack, only to find herself momentarily entangled with a hovering bouquet. It was a precarious ballet, but it worked. Slowly, he began to untangle himself from the most immediate threats, his movements becoming more confident, more human, more audacious. Then came the most dangerous challenge. The binding ceremony had resumed. The bride who had initially threatened to seal him as her mate was now at the center of the room, floating on a platform of glowing energy, her arms outstretched as she chanted in the alien language. He knew he couldn't simply dodge this one. He had to engage, to find a way to survive without offending anyone, or worse, accidentally agreeing to a permanent interstellar marriage. He took a deep breath and focused on the bride he trusted. Together, they synchronized their movements, weaving through ribbons, dodging desserts, and maintaining eye contact amidst the chaos. His allied bride whispered telepathically, guiding him through the steps of a human-adapted version of the ritual. He mimicked her motions, adding his own improvisational flair, and to his immense relief, it worked. The binding ceremony fizzled, leaving him standing upright, sticky, exhausted, and somehow intact. The other brides paused, watching with a mix of admiration, confusion, and lingering romantic curiosity. It wasn't over yet. The brides weren't done testing him. They were celebrating, teasing, and simultaneously asserting dominance in the most hilariously dramatic ways possible. One launched a parade of sparkling desserts in his direction, another unleashed a mental projection of herself dancing around him, and a third attempted to tie him into a sparkling cocoon with glowing ribbons. He ducked, sidestepped, and laughed through it all, realizing that embracing the chaos was the only way to survive and even enjoy it. Amid the pandemonium, subtle romantic connections flourished. The ally bride floated close, and their mental signals intertwined in a delicate dance of shared amusement, teasing, and affection. He stumbled briefly, slipping on a particularly sticky dessert cube, and she caught him, her wings brushing his face in a way that made his pulse race. It wasn't the most traditional romantic moment, but in this environment of absurdity, it was perfect. The other brides noticed the connection, and surprisingly, they seemed to accept it, some with a begrudging sigh, others with playful smirks. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the chamber's energy began to settle. Confetti cannons ceased firing, ribbons floated gently to the floor, and the telepathic hum quieted to a tolerable murmur. He stood amidst a field of sparkling remnants, sticky desserts, and mildly disgruntled brides, panting and grinning despite the chaos. He had survived. He had even managed to forge a connection with one extraordinary bride. The robotic attendant floated past, holding a clipboard and scanning the room. "Congratulations, participant. You have successfully navigated the bridal chamber," it intoned, its voice monotone yet somehow triumphant. He raised a sticky hand in acknowledgement, muttering, "Yeah, truly, comfortable." He caught the eye of his ally bride, and she telepathically conveyed a playful smirk. "Barely," he responded mentally, earning a delighted squeal. As he prepared to exit, or at least move towards some semblance of normalcy, he noticed a news sign glowing faintly in the corner. "Broom Training Level 2. His chest tightened with equal parts dread and amusement. He was exhausted, sticky, and mildly traumatized, but he had survived a room full of alien brides, negotiated mental signals, and dodged zero-gravity attacks while preserving a romantic connection. Somehow, he had emerged victorious, and in true human fashion, he couldn't help but grin at the absurdity of it all. And as he looked back at the brides, who waved, cheered, and occasionally winked telepathically, he realized something important. Humans might be fragile, limited, and utterly unprepared for interstellar mating chaos, but with a mix of improvisation, humor, and a bit of stubborn charm, they could survive, and even thrive, in situations that would overwhelm most species. He stepped forward, sticky but victorious, hand brushing against his chosen bride, a laugh escaping his lips. The chamber had tested him in every conceivable way, and he had passed. More than that, he had earned a connection in a world designed to overwhelm. The universe might throw absurd, chaotic, and romantic challenges at humans, but humans, awkward, clever, resilient humans, had a way of turning chaos into triumph, laughter, and occasionally, love.